Welcome back to Historian Tells the Story. Tonight we delve into the profound stories of human endurance, ambition, and the quiet moments that shape history. So dim the lights, find a comfortable spot, and let's explore together. Our journey begins in the quiet hills of Kentucky on February 12, 1809, in the humble one-room log cabin near Hodgenville, where Abraham Lincoln was born into poverty. His early life was marked by hardship. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a stern carpenter and farmer, while his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, instilled in him a sense of quiet reflection. The family moved frequently, chasing land and opportunity, enduring rough frontier life. Tragedy struck when Abraham was just 9 years old, his mother dying of milk sickness, leaving an invisible wound that shaped his melancholic personality. Light returned with his father's remarriage to Sarah Bush Johnston, a kind widow who brought warmth and, crucially, books into their home. While his father prioritized hard labor, Sarah encouraged young Abe's hunger for learning. Despite minimal formal schooling, less than a year in total, Lincoln was relentlessly curious, borrowing every book he could find, sometimes walking miles for a few precious pages of the Bible, Aesop's fables, or Shakespeare. People found him unusual tall, awkward, yet incredibly strong, and his quiet words carried a weight beyond his years. He wasn't satisfied with the life he was born into. Books taught him how to think and to dream. He famously said, "The things I want to know are in books. My best friend is the man who will get me a book I ain't read." By his early 20s, Lincoln stood remarkably tall at 6'4", with a lean, weathered face and a thoughtful voice. In 1831, he arrived in New Salem, Illinois, with no money or clear plan. But people were drawn to his honesty, earning him the nickname Honest Abe. He was known for returning overpaid change and borrowed items in better condition. His wit and gift for storytelling also won people over, making them forget their troubles. In New Salem, he built trust and began his public life, winning a seat in the state legislature in 1834 after an initial loss. He also briefly served as a captain in the Black Hawk War, though he saw no combat. Lincoln then set his sights on the law, studying alone and passing the Illinois bar exam by 1836. In Springfield, Illinois, he built a reputation as a skilled, fair, and ethical lawyer, using plain speech and humor without humiliating opponents. It was there he met Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a wealthy Kentucky family. Their courtship was complicated, but they married in 1842. Their union was passionate but stormy. Mary had a fiery temper, and Lincoln struggled with melancholy, compounded by the deaths of 3 of their 4 sons, Sedgwick at 4, Willie at 11, and Thomas in childhood. He carried deep private sorrow, a sadness described by friends as a constant shadow, yet he kept going, understanding that the law was about fairness and justice, imagining a more just country. By the mid-1850s, America was deeply divided over slavery. Lincoln, initially a one-term congressman, was drawn back into public life, believing firmly that slavery must not expand. The 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide on slavery, was a betrayal of founding ideals to him. In 1858, his debates with Stephen A. Douglas, though he lost the Senate race, propelled him onto the national stage, as his calm, persistent arguments against a nation remaining half slave and half free spread nationwide in a divided field. Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th president in November 1860. The South, fearing his presidency, threatened their way of life, and the institution of slavery, began to secede even before he took office. When Lincoln assumed office in March 1861, 7 Southern states had already seceded. He desired unity, but when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April, the Civil War began. Lincoln, despite having no military experience, led the nation, reading military books and consulting generals, making difficult decisions under immense pressure and heavy doubts. The war was brutal, with rising death tolls and widespread devastation. He faced constant criticism and personal grief, especially after his son Willie died in the White House in 1862. Amidst this chaos, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territory free. This transformative act redefined the war as a moral battle, not just for Union preservation, but for its very soul, embodying his belief that if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Later that year, dead, in November 1863, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, a 2-minute, 272-word speech on a blood-soaked battlefield. He reminded the nation that the war was about proving that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. This speech became a turning point in national identity, redefining what it meant to be American, united by ideals. By early 1865, the war's end was in sight. Lincoln, aged by the conflict, spoke of reconciliation rather than triumph in his second inaugural address in March 1865, urging the nation to heal with malice toward none, with charity for all. On April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered, ending the war and slavery. Just 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater, dying the next morning. His death plunged the nation into mourning. Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, his legacy etched in stone in memory. He battled depression and grief, never believing himself extraordinary, yet he changed everything. He didn't live to see the full impact of his work, but the seeds of moral clarity, unity, and compassion he planted continued to grow. Abraham Lincoln reminds us that greatness lies not in perfection, but in purpose, integrity, and a heart that refuses to turn away from what is right. When we think of Vikings, images of wild warriors often come to mind, but the truth is far more intricate. The Vikings were not a single people or empire. They were Norsemen, seafaring tribes from what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, active between the late 8th and early 11th centuries. The term Viking itself was a verb. To go Viking meant to go on an expedition, sometimes to trade, sometimes to raid. Most were farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, and storytellers. Deeply connected to their land, worshiping gods like Odin and Thor, their belief system was rooted in fate, woven by the mysterious Norns. Death in battle was an honor, promising a place in Valhalla, Odin's great hall, which shaped their willingness to embrace risk. Their unmatched advantage was their ships. The Viking longship, a marvel of engineering carved from oak, was narrow, flexible, and incredibly stable, capable of carrying 40 to 60 warriors. What made them so feared was their adaptability. They could cross open oceans and then glide silently up narrow rivers, striking deep inland where no one expected them, needing only a stretch of beach to land. The sight of a dragon-headed longship on the horizon became a nightmare across Europe. Yet not all were for war. Many were merchant vessels or used for exploration. The world first truly noticed. The Vikings, on a quiet summer day in 793, with the raid on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off England's coast. Monks lived peacefully there, but the Vikings came ashore swiftly, plundering the monastery and taking slaves. This shock spread fear across Christian Europe, marking the beginning of an age where no coast was truly safe. These early raids for silver, spices, livestock, and slaves were driven by survival, ambition, and a desire for honor. However, the Vikings didn't always leave. They often stayed and settled. In Ireland, towns like Dublin and Wexford began as Viking outposts, growing into thriving communities in northern England. They established the Danelaw, a territory under Norse control. Even in modern-day Russia, Vikings known as the Rus founded trade centers like Kiev. A significant shift occurred in France in 911, when Viking leader Rollo struck a deal with King Charles the Simple, receiving land that became Normandy in exchange for peace. Here, Norse culture blended with Frankish traditions. Vikings became Christian and adopted local customs, transforming from raiders to residents and even founders of kingdoms. The iconic image of a Viking warrior with a horned helmet is, in fact, a myth, originating from 19th century art and theater, not archaeology. Real Viking helmets were practical, made of iron and designed for function in battle, not style. Horns would have been a hindrance. The Vikings were also restless explorers, driven by overpopulation and the promise of riches. They sailed west beyond the British Isles to the Faroe Islands, then to Iceland in the late 9th century, where they established farms and wrote sagas. By the late 10th century, Eric the Red sailed from Iceland to Greenland, establishing settlements there. Most legendarily, around the year 1000, Eric's son Leif Erikson reached a new land, Vinland, believed to be modern-day Newfoundland in Canada, nearly 500 years before Columbus. Though their North American presence was short-lived due to conflicts and harsh winters, they had crossed the Atlantic. They also explored Eastern European rivers, trading with the Byzantine Empire. By the mid-11th century, the Viking Age began to fade. Raids decreased, and longships carried more goods than warriors. Pagan beliefs gave way to Christianity, and strong central monarchies emerged in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, replacing local chiefs with royal law and taxes. European defenses improved, making raids less effective. A final chapter came in 1066, with King Harold Hardrada's failed invasion of England, soon followed by William the Conqueror's successful Norman invasion, marking the end of an era where Vikings were seafaring raiders. Evolving into crowned rulers, their legacy remains deeply carved into modern Europe. In England, over 1,000 towns bear Norse names, and words like knife, sky, and window come from Old Norse. Even days of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, echo their gods. Cities like Dublin were founded by Norse settlers. In Iceland, their language remains almost untouched, preserving ancient sagas. The Viking spirit of daring, endurance, and curiosity continues to inspire, reminding us that they were not just fierce raiders, but poets, explorers, and founders who reshaped the world long before the Spanish arrived. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, rose majestically from the waters of Lake Texcoco. Founded in 1325 based on a prophecy, by the early 1500s it was one of the largest cities in the world, with over 200,000 inhabitants, bustling canals, and shimmering white buildings. At its heart stood the Temple Mayor, a massive double pyramid dedicated to the gods of war and rain. Aztec life was highly structured, thriving through war, trade, and religion. With tribute flowing from neighboring regions, at its pinnacle was Montezuma II, emperor and divine representative, a wise and spiritual ruler of a sophisticated civilization. However, many of their neighbors resented Aztec domination, their demands for tribute and human sacrifices. In Iwuyiju, a Spanish conquistador, landed on the peninsula with just over 500 soldiers, a few cannons, and 16 horses. As they moved inland, they encountered resistance, but also found allies in indigenous groups who resented Aztec rule. Gained a crucial advantage in Melancholy, a native woman who became his translator and confidant, enabling him to forge alliances and manipulate fears. As they approached Tenochtitlan, Montezuma received troubling reports of these pale-skinned, bearded men. On November 8, 1519, Cortez and Montezuma met for the first time. The Spaniards were stunned by Tenochtitlan's beauty and sophistication. Believing they had walked into a dream, Montezuma welcomed them with ceremony, gifts of gold, and housing in a royal palace, perhaps hoping diplomacy would avert bloodshed. However, saw this reception as weakness, interpreting hospitality as submission, and saw an empire ripe for the taking. Misunderstandings through layers of translation sowed the seeds of disaster. Initially, the Spaniards were honored guests, but aware of being vastly outnumbered, acted strategically. He placed Montezuma under house arrest, controlling the emperor in his own palace. Though Montezuma remained outwardly honored, the emperor seemed resigned, still trying to calm his people from the palace roof, but calm was crumbling. Whispers turned to anger as Aztecs saw their leader bowing to foreign invaders. While it was away to confront a rival, second in command, Pedro de Alvarado, was left in charge. During the sacred festival of Tenochtitlan, Alvarado, paranoid about an uprising, ordered a massacre of unarmed Aztec nobles, priests, and warriors in the temple mayor's courtyard. The blood of the city's most honored citizens soaked the temple stones. This act of violence ignited fury, transforming Tenochtitlan into a boiling trap. When returned, Montezuma, still imprisoned, could no longer calm his enraged people, and many no longer saw him as their leader. Attempts at diplomacy failed. Montezuma was struck by a stone and died days later under Spanish watch. Marking the final break on the night of June 30th, 1520, known as La Noche Triste, and his forces attempted to slip out of the city. Weighing themselves down with too much gold, they were attacked by Aztecs from canoes and rooftops. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of native allies perished, but regrouped. Joined by more indigenous allies who shared a hatred for the Aztecs, however, an invisible enemy had already entered Tenochtitlan, smallpox. Introduced by a single infected Spanish slave, the disease spread rapidly through the city, which had no immunity. Entire families were wiped out. As many as half the city's population perished. Among the dead was Montezuma's brother and successor. The empire, leaderless and reeling, chose a young noble. As its new ruler in May 1521, Cortez began the final siege of Tenochtitlan, cutting off causeways and blockading the lake. Day by day, street by street, the Spaniards and their 100,000 native allies fought their way through. The capital. The Aztecs resisted fiercely, even starving and sick, turning temples into strongholds after 93 days. On August 13, 1521, the fighting stopped. Tenochtitlan, a shadow of its former self, had fallen, was captured, reportedly asking to kill him with a dagger. The city was reduced to ashes and ruins, its temples looted, survivors enslaved. In its place began to build Mexico City, a new capital atop the bones of a fallen civilization. The Aztec Empire, with its beauty and contradictions, was no more yet. Its legacy endures in the Nahuatl language, still spoken by millions, and in words like chocolate and tomato. It lives on in art, food, and the resilience of its descendants, reminding us that while the conquest was brutal, the Aztec spirit transformed, fusing with the new to create something unique, its heart still beating beneath the soil. For soldiers of World War I, trenches were more than battlefields. They were a way of life, a zigzagging network of mud, blood, and wire stretching across Europe. Men expected a quick war, not years of mud-soaked silence, frozen fingers, and sleeping inches from death. Trenches were narrow, often ankle-deep in a thick soup of water and rot leading to trench foot. Barbed wire snaked everywhere, and just beyond lay no man's land, a deadly zone of shell holes and corpses. Even when guns were silent, snipers and artillery strikes were ever present. The air reeked of decay, and rats and lice thrived. Yet, men adapted, digging deeper, sharing cigarettes, and carving makeshift furniture. Survival was not just physical, it was mental, clinging to identity, humor, and hope. Amidst the grime, mail call was sacred. A letter from home was proof that life beyond the wire still existed, a reminder of who they were beyond their uniform. Soldiers wrote by candlelight, often omitting the horrors to protect their loved ones. Receiving a letter was a ritual read repeatedly, folded carefully, kept close sometimes. Letters arrived too late, read aloud in memory of a fallen comrade. In a war that reduced men to numbers, letters were bridges between worlds, carrying love, fear, longing, and hope, capable of saving a man's spirit. A remarkable moment occurred on Christmas Eve, 1914. German voices began singing Silent Night across no man's land, answered by British carols. Without orders, soldiers climbed from their trenches, meeting in the middle to exchange greetings, tobacco, and even play a game of football. For a brief moment, there was no war, no enemy, just men sharing laughter and burying their dead. Though generals swiftly forbade further contact, and the truce was never repeated on such a scale, it remained a powerful memory of humanity rising above violence. Beyond the deafening noise of shells and machine guns, the most remembered aspect was the silence between battles. These long, stretching hours of waiting took a profound psychological toll. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was thick, unnatural, making every snapped twig or distant cough a potential prelude to attack at night. Tension grew, with flares casting long shadows and men whispering, afraid of their own voices. In these pauses, soldiers repaired trenches, brewed tea, played cards, and told stories, trying to anchor their minds to something beyond the mud. The silence offered no rest, only reflection where fear took root. Men counted their breaths, their days, their chances, and waited. Not out of glory, but quiet endurance. The first gas attack arrived like a strange green mist in April 1915 near Ypres, Belgium, when the Germans unleashed chlorine gas. It burned eyes and throats, turned lungs to liquid, causing men to gasp like drowning fish. Panic spread. Later came phosgene and blistering mustard gas, which lingered for weeks. Gas masks were issued, but the fear remained, an invisible, unpredictable enemy that crept into dreams. Gas changed the nature of war, turning the air itself into a weapon, leaving survivors coughing for years, their lives forever changed. Amidst the horrors, comradeship was more than friendship. It was survival men from all walks of life, their distinctions blurred by shared suffering, clung to each other. They shared everything: cigarettes, blankets, rations, and passed down trench law. Moments over weak, gritty coffee or tea were sacred, filled with jokes, songs of home, and plans for after the war. When a comrade fell, it wasn't just a name. It was a missing seat, a silence louder than the guns. The bond between brothers, forged in frost and shared comfort, kept men in the trenches, not glory or nationalism. Night in the trenches brought a different terror. Darkness blurred reality, with shadows stretching across no man's land. Every sound mattered: a footstep, click of a rifle signaling potential danger. Men took turns on sentry duty, hearts pounding, knowing a single mistake could be fatal. Sleep was brief and uneasy, filled with thunder and smoke. Whispers passed through trenches as patrols slipped into no man's land like ghosts. Letters, sometimes goodbyes, were written under flickering candles. The night forced men to confront questions the day was too busy to consider. Will I survive? Will anyone remember me? Yet with each sunrise, cold and tired, they were still there, a victory in itself. Not all wounds were visible. Trench life wore men down physically and spiritually. Shell shock, now known as PTSD, left men broken, their minds shaken by constant stress and horror. Bodies in no man's land were unrecoverable reminders of the immense cost. Survivors carried guilt, their emotions buried under layers of mud and grief. Even on leave, soldiers struggled to adjust, unable to speak of what they'd seen. War changed them fundamentally beyond physical scars. The guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, at the 11th hour. Soldiers emerged cautiously, not quite believing the noise was over. The trenches remained, slowly sinking back into the earth, leaving behind helmets, rifles, and unsent letters. Soldiers returned home, but they weren't the same. They carried unseen scars and told few stories, often speaking only of small, human moments. Though the trenches faded from the land, they remained in memory, a testament to those who endured the unendurable and proved that humanity could survive even in mud and madness. And so, these stories of Abraham Lincoln's unwavering pursuit of unity, the Vikings' bold voyages and enduring spirit, the Aztec Empire's tragic fall and resilient legacy, and the World War I soldiers' quiet endurance amidst unimaginable horror, remind us of the complexities and strength of the human spirit throughout history. Thank you for joining us tonight. Sleep well.